Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here. Lovely to be back in Spain. Haven't been in Spain for a while. Unfortunately, my Spanish is still no better than it was the last time I was in Spain, which posed some problems. About 15 years ago, I was doing a bit of work in Spain on a work trip, and I was at a dinner with some like fairly high-profile people from the Spanish Board of Tourism, the government. Kind of a long story. But it was one of these late Spanish dinners. It was like 10 p.m. Main course was probably not coming till 2 a.m. as I'd learned. And so I really needed a coffee and I wanted to practice my Spanish. And I turned to my friend beside me, who's one of the organizers of the trip, very nice Spanish lady. And I said, I'd like to ask for a coffee. How can I say, please can I have a coffee in Spanish? And she told me. We practiced, went back and forth a few times, make sure my pronunciation was just right. And so then when the waitress came past, I said, Perdón, ¿dónde cojones está mi puto café? Which I would later learn is one way of asking for coffee, or perhaps, judging by the silence that fell over the restaurant, not the best way to ask for a coffee. If you don't speak Spanish, ask a friend. So I'm very excited to talk to you a little bit about all my favorite things: open source, business, technology, creativity, design, all in one place. These are all the topics that I've spent my career on. And creativity in particular is something I'm very curious about, very interested in. I've spent a lot of years thinking about creativity as this kind of abstract subject, trying to figure out how does it work, where does it come from, where does it go? And it's one of these tricky things, really. If you try and define what creativity is, you don't get very far. I've tried. If you look up the definition of creativity, you get the ability to create. Super helpful, thank you. I understand it perfectly now. But what I've broadly found after many, many years and a lengthy career of thinking and researching creativity is that I think people broadly fall into two different categories of creative. Almost all of us, particularly people in this room, you're probably one of two different types of creative person. And the first type of creative person is that person who just like embodies creativity. It flows through their veins. You hand them a paintbrush, art happens. The ability to create is just sort of permanently with them at all times. You give them a guitar, they suddenly bust out in a solo and you say, oh my God, that's incredible. And they say, actually, I'm a drummer. You know, we all know someone like this. And if you're in that group of creative people, the most important thing you need to understand is that the rest of us, we all hate you. Right? You are a very frustrating person. You're like our best friend who does nothing but drink beer and eat burgers and go to bed at 3 a.m., but somehow rolls out of bed in the morning with a six-pack of abs, perfect makeup, and hair looking incredible. We don't understand how you do it. For the rest of us, creativity is this thing that seems to come and go, to ebb and flow. It's like a dance with an invisible partner that when it's going, it feels incredible. Time slows down. The act of creation just sort of comes out of nowhere, and it makes us feel alive. But at other times, creativity disappears. We wonder where it's gone. I've spent time searching for my creativity in books when it has left me. I've traveled the world searching for my creativity when I can't find it. And creativity is this elusive thing for me that is sometimes there and sometimes not. But I found one trick for coaxing it back into existence. And the strange thing about it is that creativity, in my experience, is so counterintuitive. It doesn't work the way you think it works. I think we have this built-in sense that creativity starts with more gear, more money, more time, more support, more funding, more people, more team. More. If only we had more, then we could be creative. The block to creativity surely is that we don't have enough. But what I've found is that creativity starts with less and leads to more. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you about today. And I'm going to give you a few examples and a couple of metaphors to work through this. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at Ghost, which has sort of been how I've explored this over the course of my career. And so if we take an empty room, if I were to put you in this beautiful empty room, big open space, what I imagine is like a perfect creative space. And I said, make some art, what would you do? That's a difficult question. There's not very much context, right? There's not very much to go off. Placed into this big open space, it's kind of difficult to imagine what you might do in a space like this. In fact, it might get a little bit existential. At a certain point, you might just be sitting there going, what is art, technically? What are we doing here? And so if we narrow the parameters a little bit and go into a different setting with slightly more confines, and ask the same question again, make some art, what would you do? Okay, well now it's a little bit easier. Now the frame of thinking changes a little bit, right? We've got some paints, we've got this canvas, we've got a chair, we've got some cues to go off. I've got some idea of what I might do in the space. It seems like we're doing a painting-based art thing. But still, if we zoom in a little further, oh, we get to that canvas. We're back in the empty room. We're back in that blank space. It's hard to get going. The scariest screen on earth, right? The blank canvas before you begin. And so there's this exercise that artists use to spur creativity and to practice creativity called the doodle drawing. It's very, very simple. Only thing you have to do is squiggle something, anything at all on a piece of paper in front of you or on a canvas or on whatever medium you have to give you a starting point. And suddenly that changes things. By narrowing the options of what's possible to create, you create a problem to solve. And suddenly creativity from wherever it disappeared to, whatever hiding place it snuck off to, reappears and says, aha, this is what we're doing. Creativity suddenly pops out of nowhere. The blank canvas was the problem. More was the problem, less was the inspiration. And this can apply to all sorts of different mediums. There's this old tale that's attributed to Ernest Hemingway, allegedly. No one actually knows if it was really him. But supposedly in the 1920s, he was at lunch with a group of writers, and they were all having a debate and placing bets on who could write the shortest story. In fact, what was the shortest possible complete story you could tell, the lowest number of words? And the bet they all made was that it couldn't be done in 10 words or less. And Hemingway did it in 6. For sale, baby shoes, never worn. Inarguably a complete story, but not a complete story because of how much it illustrates, but because of how much of our own values, our own ideas, our own memories, our own fantasies we project onto the story itself. But what's interesting about the story is that the format is how it came into existence. In what other situation would someone choose to write a 6-word story? Probably none, right? But the constraint of write a story in 10 words or less led to the creation of something beautiful. And it doesn't just have to be small things, it could be big things too. In 1951, Jack Kerouac, a prolific writer, was fed up with writing books on his typewriter because on a typewriter, every time he gets to the end of the page, it goes ding. You pull out a sheet of paper, you get a new one, you put it in, you roll it up, you reset the carriage, and you start going again. He found that interrupted his writing flow, so he picks a different creative constraint, almost the opposite. On a 120-foot scroll of tracing paper, he wrote an entire book called On the Road in the space of 3 weeks, and it went on to become a bestseller that sold 4 million copies and was translated into 32 languages precisely because of this blazing stream of consciousness style of writing that resulted from the format, the constraint of writing on a continuous piece of paper. The format and the constraint of how he approached the task at hand influenced the output of what was created. So the blank canvas and what you squiggle on it, that's kind of the question, and that's what I have finally found my way through over the course of career working in open source software. I started as a freelance web designer many moons ago, and I became a core contributor to the WordPress open source design team. I was the deputy head of design at the time, and this was a wonderful introduction to open source. Now, at the time, I got into it just because I thought it would be a good business decision. It might raise my reputation as a web designer, and it would be a good thing. But what I didn't expect was that I fell in love along the way with the idea and the ideals of open source. The 1997 essay by Eric Raymond about the cathedral and the bazaar, comparing the institution of Microsoft to the chaotic collaboration of Linux, and how people all over the world could somehow produce an operating system that could compete with a giant corporation supposedly of well-organized developers. This idea that collaboration over competition would give more to humanity than just making something to make as much money as possible. It gave my work meaning, it felt important, and it was wonderful. But along the way, I also learned the darker side of many open source projects, which is that more often than not, there's a company in the background, a for-profit company. It's raised lots of money that has this venture-funded component to it. And I found that not always were the ideals of the project living up to what it said it would be. Sometimes decisions were made that weren't about what was best for the user or the products or the projects. They were about what was best for the bottom line. And at the same time, WordPress was going in a new direction. It was going for more users, more use cases, to be this open source operating system for the web rather than the independent publishing platform that I had initially adopted it for. And so I guess what I learned along the way, and at that point, was that all companies have a mission, but they also have a habit. All companies have this habitual trajectory, and it's kind of the same every time, particularly with startups. They start out small and cute. It's just a couple of friends building something together, and then they get a little bit bigger. You hire a few more people. But companies are hungry little fuckers, and sooner or later, they eat their brothers and sisters, and they just keep getting bigger, and growth is the thing that we love. Growth, 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 until everything at every point is owned by a single company, and we're all sort of wondering what the hell's going on. And at some point, we lose the ability as company owners, perhaps, to look in the mirror and say, how much growth is enough? At what point do you stop saying, just one more acquisition, bro? Just one more. So all companies have this mission, and ultimately it's to serve their shareholders, right? That's the truth that underlies most missions, is the mission beneath the mission is to serve shareholders. And so the squiggle that kind of started my journey for Ghost was asking the question, what if they didn't? And this was initially just this thought exercise that kind of tickled my interest. What if a company had a mission and actually stuck to it? What if a company had a mission without this underlying objective? What if you took this idea of growing a company and getting as big as possible and getting as wealthy as possible, and what if you tried to do the opposite? What if you tried to make a company that did its best not to get really big, that did its best not to get really wealthy? That's kind of like a funny contradiction, right? It's like the inverse. Well, I mean, obviously, the thing you would do is you'd make a non-profit organization, right? It could never be bought or sold. And then all these other ideas sort of immediately started spinning off it. Well, if you don't have to buy it or sell it, and you don't have to grow it really big, well, then it could be open source, sustainable, remote. You can be just entirely true to the mission and make decisions based on what's best for the users and the product. You don't need a big idea. It could be a small idea, a handful of people. You could have the constraint on the canvas that you would then create within. And so this idea like ate at me for a long time, this idea of having a small company true to its mission and a product that was really focused, a product that was not trying to be a web operating system, but that was really like reimagining WordPress as the publishing platform, but for the modern age. And so in 2012, I made this blog post. I was like, get all these ideas out, because they'd been just bugging me and sitting with me for ages. And so I wrote them all up in a blog post. And I also had an idea for a business model, right? We'd make this open source product. Hopefully it was good. If it's good, it would attract users. Some users would need hosting, so we would sell hosting. The revenue from the hosting would go to the nonprofit foundation as its source of funding. The foundation would hire more developers who'd make more open source software, which would attract more users who would need more hosting. And so we would have this virtuous cycle. And the blog post took off. It went very viral. 6 months later, it turned into a Kickstarter campaign that ended up being the third most funded open source Kickstarter campaign of all time on Kickstarter. And what was interesting is that the product got a bunch of attention for the ideas it was trying to promote in publishing. But what got the most attention was not the product itself, but rather the ideas and the ideals behind it. Ghost, the blogging platform that won't and can't sell out to Facebook. The constraint caught the interest more than the output of the thing that was being created. Now, I don't have time in the time we have here together to give you a full history of Ghost and everything that happened in the in-between, so we're going to kind of skip ahead 12 years, and I'll just show you how far we've come in the meantime. That small idea that started from a blog post that turned into a Kickstarter campaign is now a team of 35 people that makes a fully open source, independent publishing platform that people use every day to run independent media businesses, creators, brand journalism. They send newsletters with it, and indeed, they in fact sell memberships and subscriptions to fund and sustain open source media and independent media and publishing throughout the world. So we have a large number of independent local news sites, national news sites around the world that use Ghost. Some you may have heard of. Football Mundial's digital edition runs on Ghost. One of the greatest design and development resources for people like you runs on Ghost. Maybe you've heard of it. It's called Penpot. And some of the largest companies around today started out as publications. Before it was the behemoth that it is today, OpenAI was a independent AI research publication. OpenAI.com ran on Ghost all the way up until the launch of ChatGPT, which fortunately or unfortunately was also on Ghost. And we were hosting it, which was interesting. So the constraint is interesting when you go 12 years down the line and when some success has proved out with it, because it creates new dynamics. From this starting point of less, what if we start with less? creativity flows in different directions to that you might expect. And so the early days were like, how do we stay alive? How do we operate? How do we get this done? But now the latter days, we're at almost $9 million dollars a year in annual recurring revenue. And over the lifetime of Ghost, we've achieved $37 million in total revenue for the nonprofit foundation, 100% of which has been generated sustainably by ourselves, no outside funding of any time. And what I'm more proud of than that is that we've generated about $110 million now of revenue, of which we take 0% for independent media, independent journalism, independent publishing. That's a lot. But we can only ever hire 50 people. We're about 35 now. So you get to this interesting point, right? Okay, if you've committed to staying small, you've committed to not taking the wealth out of the company, well then, where does it all go? And so the next era of Ghost is the one that I'm actually most excited about, which is if you can't grow the company to encompass everything, then you have to grow the ecosystem around the company. You have to start investing in the ecosystem around the business as opposed to trying to create the ecosystem within the business. And so as Ghost grows and as the ecosystem grows, opportunities emerge for other people to set up businesses, other people to create integrations or agencies or hosts or services that are around Ghost that we can then subsequently invest in supporting. And it's really about what kind of world is the one that you would really like to live in. I don't know about you, but in the choice between a single brand and the everything store that owns all things, and you go there no matter what it is you need, or a town and a city with a long tail of independent vendors, of independent businesses that are owned and operated by different people, that's the one that I want to live in. And that's the kind of ecosystem that the constraint ends up creating. All constraints are interesting, and all of them have different flavors of how they emerge. And what squiggle you put on the canvas is really up to you. And if I can give you something to take away from this talk, it would really be the ways in which you can choose your own adventure, and perhaps the seed of an idea for how you might apply this to all of the wonderful things that you guys are working on. There are lots and lots of different constraints you can take, and I'll just throw you a handful of examples. Good friend of mine, Peter Levels, he's quite famous nowadays. Probably a few of you have heard of him, but back in 2012 or so, he was nobody, just a guy with a backpack in Thailand trying to get somewhere. And he picked a time constraint, and his time constraint was, I'm going to start 12 startups in 12 months. Every month I'm going to start a new company. When the next month rolls around, I'm moving on from that one and I'll start a new one. 11 of them failed. The 12th turned into nomadlist.com. Jeff Bezos in 2002 noticed that there was lots of disparate collaboration happening within Amazon, lots of dysfunction as the company grew and teams grew. And so he sent out a very famous memo, a mandate, an API mandate. He said, all teams henceforth will communicate by API only. There will be no other form of communication allowed. This was a process constraint, and that process constraint led to such a well-formed set of APIs that the entire company reshaped itself around departments communicating by API. And those APIs became so robust that today they generate $117 billion a year, and we call them Amazon Web Services. In 1989, the head of products at Nintendo didn't have a large operating budget and didn't have a whole lot of room to maneuver. And while the emerging video game sector was getting off the ground, most people were putting all their money into expensive components to produce the most high-end device. But Nintendo took a different approach. Instead, they took a smaller budget and put it towards mass-produced, cheap components so that they would combine in different and interesting ways to create delight for users. At the time of its launch, the Game Boy came out. It was plastic, had no color screen, had an underpowered 4 megahertz processor, and it had only 32 kilobytes for games. But it had 10 times the battery life of its nearest competitor. And while its nearest competitors immediately had supply chain shortages for their advanced chips, Nintendo, with its off-the-shelf, cheap, well-used components, combined in different ways, shipped 118 million units, while its competitors only shipped 3 million. Quite the difference in taking a constraint of cheap parts. Good creative constraints are self-imposed arbitrary limitations, and all those words are important. A constraint is best when it's something that you choose rather than something that's imposed upon you. Something that is random to some extent, it almost doesn't matter what it is, but it's great if it's contrarian. It's great if it's something that's different to what everyone else is doing, because it tends to take you down paths that not everyone else is going down. Good creative constraints reduce your available outcomes. They make life harder. They take away optionality and force you down a particular path. They force you to commit. Sometimes they make you think from a new perspective as a result, one you might not have considered before. They increase your focus and they clarify decisions by virtue of not having all these other options available to you. And they often lead to new ideas to work around that problem you created. Whatever that squiggle on the canvas is, that's the problem you're now solving. And perhaps most importantly of all, the best creative constraints are things that seem slightly insane to everyone else, but fun and interesting to you. My name is John O'Nolan. You can find all my contact information here. And we are, in fact, hiring for designers, which my head of design here told me I have to mention, otherwise I'm in trouble. So I'm going to be hanging around in the Q&A if you want to chat or have any questions afterwards. Otherwise, thank you very much for having me.